Hello, everybody. My name is Sil the DM. I hope you're enjoying this really shitty webcam for another campaign catch-up. So today, we're doing things a little different. You get to see my face, which is just horrible for you. I'm sorry. But I didn't really have time for a full script for the campaign catch-up. Uh, Mostly because I run games on Thursdays and Mondays. So after Thursday's session and doing a catch up for Thursday's campaign, I then had to immediately deal with the fact that I had to do Thursday's session, and then the weekend happened, and I normally use my weekend to do things. So I didn't really have time to script this out in the way I did with my other videos. So instead you get to realize how much of a hand talker I am and how much I do this all the fucking time, even when no one can see me. It's kind of embarrassing. But let's just ignore all of that. Today, we're going to be going over the campaign catch up for my Monday campaign, The Sands of Calimare. To set the players up, I asked them all to give me a reason in their backstory why they wanted to reach the capital of the continent of Jaram, Calimare. This being the southernmost continent outside of the Antarctic shelf. And the players all provided a reason for wanting to go. Some more story driven, others more, I just wanted to make this character, he doesn't really have a reason to be anywhere, so I'll just say that's where he wants to go for no reason. He's just kind of wandering around. And I was like, it's not really, it's not super conductive to good storytelling, but we can make it work. However, either through just being on their own for a very long time, in some cases, or the immense cost of traveling across oceans to arrive in Jaram, the players arrive in the city of Rosmaran, one of the few coastal gems that line the southern continent. Uh, the bitch ass broke, no money, and that's kind of by design. Um, they not only arrive without money, but they arrive at the worst time of the year for travel. It's the last 2 or 3 weeks before the real start of the summer season, where traveling across the internal of the continent basically needs to be done with magic or at great expense to deal with the intense heat of the desert and just how bad it can get during the summer. However, that's when they're here, and if they don't want to spend an entire 4 month season trapped in Rosmaran, separated from their goals, they would need to find a way to overcome this. Now, the players asked around and tried to figure out what they could do, eventually discovering that there was a very foolhardy caravan planning to leave within the next few days. And thanks to either intimidating or becoming friendly with some of the locals of Rosmaran, the party figured out that they could meet with the purveyor of this caravan, the owner, the backer, the financier. Um, and so they did. They went to meet him at a tavern. And that's where they ended up meeting each other as well. And that's where we find most of our players. Riok, the AVX cleric of Ramza. AVX in my setting are sort of like Aarakocra, but different. And in my setting, they look more like the Aven from Magic the Gathering. Full humanoids with arms and legs, and wings coming off of their back. So, very different, but extremely bird-like. The Kitsune Bard, Kieran, the Kitsune Ranger, Aesir, uh, Kitsune being the humanoid fox person race from my setting, which, if you're interested about, I can post videos about that as well. The homebrew race I have in my setting, as well as some feats that relate to it. Blair, the changeling rogue, though no one knows she's a changeling at this point in the story. Hrafgranir, the bugbear barbarian. And at this point in the story, they were also joined by a druid by the name of Leah, who regrettably doesn't stay with them for the length of the campaign, but it's, I mean, if we want to get real technical, there was also a human fighter with the group at this point, but the player didn't make it to the first session and then just messaged me and told me they were never going to come because of a sudden change on their schedule. And so they got replaced with Aesir, basically. It was a long story. And not really, that was the story. It wasn't long, it was just garbage. Um, so they met the owner of this caravan, a halfling, very rotund, cheerful halfling named Ambar of Kotu. Ambar, delighted that they were interested in joining his caravan, was concerned because through his father, the caravan was already guarded. The players all thought they could just go, well, I mean, we'll help protect your caravan, we'll work for you. You help get us there and give us food and water, and in return, we'll protect your caravan. And Ember would be like, in any other situation, that would be perfect, perfect. But my father called it a favor with a renowned mercenary group that owed him something. So I'm afraid I can't really do anything to allow you to just come along like that. That's up to them, as they are the ones responsible for security. And the players ended up meeting the Flight of Ramza, if you remember that name from earlier. That is the god that Ryuk is a cleric of. The Flight, led by an AVX by the name of Brazen, is a pretty well-renowned mercenary group. Sellswords, bodyguards, caravan protectors, extremely skilled AVX. All AVX group. And after meeting with the party, and especially finding out that one of the members of the party was a cleric of Ramza who could use their divine power to create water daily to help reduce the weight this group would cost to the caravan, uh, Brazen decided that they could come, but they would need to raise enough money to pay for their food. Uh, though much not too far into the story, due to Ryuk using a third-party subclass for his cleric, the community domain from the Humblewood, I think it was. No, was it Humblewood? I don't remember. But it's called the community domain. Would eventually be able to create a fair amount of food using their channel divinities. Excuse me. So the group was like, "When are you leaving? How much time do we have to raise 100 gold?" And the response was, "We're leaving the day after tomorrow." So they were like, okay, let's make 100 gold each in a day and a half." Amber and Brazen left, and the group, well, they tried to find a way to do it. They looked into doing small odds and ends, different jobs, mostly being intrigued by the bounty board, deciding that they would hunt down this skeevy-looking man who was wanted for larceny, kidnapping, drugs, what's the word? Selling drugs. I don't remember what the word is. Trafficking drugs? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Drugs. Drugs? Drugs? Do you spice? I hope so. And the group decided to do this. Now, technically, during the first session, the human fighter wasn't a part of the group. They had basically been so standoffish and paranoid that they didn't interact with the other group when they arrived. And so they began to follow them. And Kieran, the keen-eyed Kitsune, caught on to this. And when they discovered they were being followed, they sort of set up a pseudo-ambush, fearing that it was someone who meant their group ill. Finding them in an alley in front of an oddly cloaked figure with this sort of magical shimmer. When confronted, however, the figure in the cloak disappeared, and Aesir, who that figure became instead of our human fighter, explained that they wanted to journey with them as well. They had heard the conversation, they were in the room with them, but they were too socially awkward to interact, which, oddly enough, fits Aesir's character just fine. So, yeah, it wasn't that hard of a change. The group then began asking around at the wharf for the guards about any chance that they might have a lead or anything towards this wanted man. Eventually, they met a younger man, a younger guard, who seems to be from a different continent and probably moved here quite recently, who, once he got them aside, explained of the corruption in the guard and how he was trying to weed it out, people who were accepting bribes and whatnot. And he gave them a lead once he was far enough away from his superior. The group went and hunted down a warehouse in an old abandoned district of heavily damaged buildings, which had a pretty substantial thuggish look to it and guards. Uh, Dispatching of the guards quite noisily and with a lot of pain. At least one member of the group went down. I believe Blair was dropped by a ranged attack, and Kieran Healing worded Blair back to existence. The group blasted their way into the warehouse proper, where they discovered the man they were there to fight. As long as people had been there had been a steady stream of people fleeing the building during the fight. Gnomes and halflings mostly. When they managed to burst into the warehouse, they noticed 2 rows of over 12 surgical tables each. And on each table was a child. Uh, Most looked rather sickly, probably homeless, orphans. Uh, and they were sort of surgically cut open. It looked like that there were magical runes assisting in keeping the children stable while in this state, and just at a cursory glance, it looked like they were removing large parts of the children's intestinal tract and stuffing them full of bags of drugs, which made members of the party various levels of disgusted, horrified, and furious. Uh, they ended up killing the wanted man who had taken some of this drug and managed to almost fight a group of 4 of them off. Like, he was doing work. But barbarians are strong, and he died. However, as this happened, a figure appeared in the room, and the whole warehouse began to burn. A fireball sort of going off in the center of the place, probably killing many of the children instantly. Fearing what would happen to the other children, uh, they pulled the one closest to the doors off of the table, trying to save them. Once the child was away from the magical ruins, however, they very quickly began to die. Ryok using a bit of healing to try and seal the surgical wounds in the body, sealing the drugs inside, and keeping the child alive, but probably not good. Also, around this time, Great Air pocketed one of the bags of drugs from inside one of the bodies of the children, curious as to what they would do, and hoping to maybe sell it later. Uh, they met with the guard, who they learned was actually sort of like a spy sent from the Empire to try and weed out corruption within the desert cities. Rushed to the captain of the guard with the child they saved. They earned their keep, they earned their gold, their bounty, and a little bit of more money, actually. I believe they were paid extra for saving the child. Who it would later be revealed during this instant that the captain of the guard knew. She was a homeless girl, but someone that the captain of the guard would go out of her way to help quite often. They ended up meeting an elf, a heavy-set doctor named Auroriel, who the captain of the guard had called to see to the girl's health. As they were leaving, Aesir, the one who had interacted with the cloaked figure, discovered a coin purse on his body, full with enough gold to pay for all of them. But since they had earned their bounties, they used a lot of that money to party instead. Setting out into the desert with Ambar and Brozin, the group ran into several encounters along the way. Dust maggots, a homebrewed creature of my own, which is a sort of sandworm. They attacked the party in quite large numbers, which was odd, because normally dust maggots, as they're called, wouldn't attack a party of this size. And the group discovered that there was a dust maggot adult, a matron, a mother, that was heavily wounded and dying. and that the large swarms of her children would basically attack humanoid parties and drag them away, trying to feed their dying mother to try and help. They put the mother down after killing basically all of the children as well. They found a bit of loot on the dead bodies that had already been gathered around the mother and continued on. At this point, weeks passed, and the desert began to really take its toll on some members. There was a lot of uncomfortable constitution saves, and it sort of becomes a running joke in the campaign that whenever a con save comes up, it's just brutal pain. Because not only is Jiram a desert continent, where almost all of the desert, like the continent itself, is desert, it's a desert of black sands, which is just far too hot. Uh, yeah, so they made it for quite a while, occasionally interacting with wildlife and monsters. And after a few weeks of travel, they found themselves beset by an ambush. Uh, a group of well armed attackers who sprung a trap on them during the night, who they managed to handedly beat with the help of the flight, of course. Combat at this early part of the campaign is a little messy. It's a lot of just players just dealing with characters that are immediately around them while a fight is going on in the background. These strange ambushers all were carrying some sort of holy symbol or religious mark that no one really had any idea what it was. But they didn't take it as a good sign. And while looking over the bodies, Grenier ended up getting stung by a scorpion. An extremely deadly scorpion. He did not pass his constitution save. The party, now moving with double haste, starting to run the camels pulling the wagons ragged in an effort to try and save Grenier, who was very quickly approaching death. They ended up finding a small hut near a very, very small oasis with a lot of weird bulbous plants growing outside by the water. Hoping to find someone with medical knowledge and save their friend, they attempted to approach where the sands in front of the hut swelled up into this large, hulking sand elemental. After a pretty rough fight dispatching the beast, the door to the hut opened, and they witnessed an old caboosian lady, which is a bug race. If you've been following along with my other series, you would have already heard about a caboosian. Caboosians in my setting are a 3 subrace bug collective, which are sort of like bug humanoids. Insectoid, I think is the phrase I should use. Uh, as she opened the door, they noticed that a sandstorm was fast approaching, and she called them inside. The hut itself was just a large open room with stairs leading below ground. Leaving the camels there, they all ran down below, and she pulled out through the roots under the water, the oasis behind her home, one of those weird plants they had seen. Thankful that Grenier was asleep, she used it to cure him of his illness, basically before he died. Grenier, the player, at this point was looking into character replacements, because if they didn't find a way to cure him within the next day, he would have died for being so reckless in the desert. She was glad he was unconscious, though, since the plant, a special hybrid she had made, was an extremely powerful medicine, but highly addictive, and she hadn't found a way to offset the addictiveness of it. But the fact that Grenier was unconscious and wouldn't be able to experience the effects of the plant to create that addictive urge, she felt it was safe enough to try. And he didn't feel addicted to it, which was nice. Talking with the lady, they learned that she was a druid who had once served with a great human czar years and years and years ago in a pretty bloody military capacity. There was a bit of a scrap of invading forces, and she had helped the czar and healed him through the battles. And he bestowed upon her this oasis, the hut, and the Guardian, which, when he died, sort of became a prison for her. It wouldn't listen to her commands, and with its original owner dead, over time, the Sand Guardian just sort of became corrupted, and she was not trapped here, but sort of like a prisoner in her own home. But they would discover that she had pretty expansive tunnels that she had found and connected to her home, being a natural borer. Uh, and during the night, while everyone rested, she died. She was very old, and it was her time. In the morning, when everyone found that she was dead, the party buried her, and the cleric Ryok did a little ceremony. Not really knowing who she would have prayed to, but hoping that Ramza and the other Avix gods would take care of her. And then Grenier woke up, confused as to why everyone was sad, because he slept through all of that. The party then had two options: to wait out the storm in the hut, or push through the cave system, which she had explained would lead them to the next village. Uh, shoot. Shangri Khan, that's it. Got the name, came to me. Should have wrote up some notes if I didn't write up a full script. But, yeah. Uh, she had connected her tunnels to Shangri Khan. In fact, a hill a few miles out of Shangri Khan, but close enough to the city that it could be gotten to, basically. Fearing that they had already lost a fair bit of time by going off the beaten path trying to find a cure for Grenier, the party, who didn't really want to just sit there for days, voted to go through the tunnels, which made the flight of Ramza pretty anxious because, birds in a tunnel. You know what happens to birds in a tunnel? They die. That's kind of the whole thing with canaries. Uh, but the group decided, and Ambar was technically still in control of the caravan, so the flight agreed. And though it made them quite anxious to be working through the well-worked and semi-natural tunnels, they pushed through without any too major mental breakdowns. Though, at one point during the journey, they were attacked by a large group of mushroom men. Uh, at which point, Ambar, who had joined other previous fights, sort of took the lead on the fight, attributing new abilities that they hadn't seen him using before. When the NPC had leveled up with the party earlier, he had ended up multi-classing into Bard, and so I ended up singing and writing a song for him to sort of help translate that into game mechanics, because he was now able to buff the party while fighting, which turned out alright. They managed to deal with the mushroom monsters slowly but surely. After that, they did a little bit of exploring, and one of them found a black obsidian onyx-looking sword, sort of made out of stone, which they took, and after a bit of time discovered that it was just a slightly magical sword that would explode on the first critical hit or critical fail that it rolled, dealing an AoE burst around the target. Yeah, it's not amazing, but it was something. After this, they exited into Shangri Khan, a large internal city, again built around an oasis, as almost all cities on Drum are, just for the sake of water. However, they found the welcome in the city very sparse and cold. People wouldn't meet their eyes, and people were slamming shut their doors as they walked by. At which point Ambar spotted his cousin, Radek of Kotu. Uh, Confused by the cold treatment, Ambar began to interrogate his cousin, who looked very nervous and confused. He explained that they shouldn't have been here, and after sending away the help that, helped him run his shop, he explained that a cultist, a cult, a group of cultists had sort of infiltrated Shangri Khan and gained the ear of the Tsar, and that people who were causing a fuss or helping foreigners to the city would go missing pretty quickly. and that the roving groups of cultists that were being sent out to the sands surrounding the city would usually return in a few days with a lot of nearly dead people who would also be taken away. The group pretty quickly made the assumption that the group that attacked them, who they killed, was probably the group of scouts sent out from this city. Ambar really wanted to help Radek somehow to do something, and the party was sort of inclined that way as well, as Radek had done everything he could at this point to help them. But the Flight were much more concerned with their job. They weren't hired to assassinate cultists or deal with this sort of situation. They weren't manned for it. They only had enough of them to protect the wagons, and that's kind of what they've been paid to do. Ambar eventually conceded this point that he couldn't force Brazin or the others to do this, as it would be risking their life for something that they shouldn't have to risk their life for. As much as they felt that it was wrong, they at the same time knew that they needed to do their job above this. The players, on the other hand, well, they didn't. And so Ambar asked the players to look into the matter, which made Brazin a little uncomfortable, as he clearly didn't want to stay in the city any longer than he had to. But he ceded that if the players wanted to look into the matter, he would wait for them until Ambar wanted to move the wagons again, and he would protect the wagons with the rest of the Flight. The group, discovering from Radek where the cultists meet and roughly how to get there, slunk their way into the sewers. They came across a party of cultists, potentially people from the city who were going to go join in on one of the ceremonies. Dispatching them, almost falling into the river, and the people who did fall into the river quickly found themselves assaulted by swarms of murderous leeches. The party managed to dispatch the group fairly quickly, but absolutely ruining their outfits at the same time, which is a shame, because this was a good opportunity for them to non-lethally knock out some civilians from the city, steal their clothes, and try to infiltrate into the ceremony proper. Finding their way to the ceremony, a secret room beneath one of the chapels above, they found a large group of civilians from the city, again wearing the same sort of cultist robes, and more of those ruffian sort of scout types. And while viewing this, a human came out from the back room. Bald, dark-skinned, wearing black and purple robes that were open at the front. He had a rod, similar to the holy symbol that the other characters, the other NPCs that the characters had dealt with before. Beyond that, in his left hand, wrapped all the way around his forearm and his fist, was a single strand of gold. And along that gold, there were rubies. Hundreds of them. And resting in his hand was a beautiful opal that looked like it was just crystallized fire. Blair, of the Varian Traders Guild, who is a fine craftsman, jeweler, and clothier, recognized it as being a powerful artifact that she had heard of from her guild. An exceptionally powerful device. Just the idea of its power is just rumors to her. Having clearly noticed that the party was there, he called them out, very confident in his position. When they came, they were hesitant, not wanting to start a fight, were so heavily outgunned and clearly outmatched. But this stranger seemed extremely confident, offering them the chance to fight him one-on-one, should they be willing to side out a champion. This made some of the cultists nervous, and this made the party exceptionally nervous, except for Grenier, who as soon as he heard duel one-on-one was already moving his way through the cloud and pulling out his polearm. And this stranger basically said that if they killed him, the cultists would leave, abandon the city. That without him, there was no way they could function in the capacity they had been. But when he won, they would need to surrender their arms and surrender in general. And there was a very brief duel. Grenier did a fair bit of damage. He got some good licks in. But this stranger was using powerful magics, as well as extremely skilled martial arts. And he quickly dispatched Grenier uh, through a mix of flurry of blows and armor of Agathis, um, forcing the other members of the party to surrender, much against their will. They were at all pretty quickly knocked unconscious, waking up several hours later, chained to large poles in the center of the city. Not quite crucified, but hanging from their arms. Think of the scene from Star Wars. Shit, it wasn't the first one. Was it the Clone Wars? I think it was the Clone Wars. Where they're trapped in the stadium and their hands are bound above their heads. Around them, and they noticed pretty quickly they were in like the center of the city. There was a large group of civilians looking very concerned and anxious, surrounded by groups of the cultist guards, and beneath them was that strange man again. And beneath him was an altar, and strapped to the altar was Radek. The man went on about how Radek had betrayed the interests of the city by assisting these strangers and trying to thwart their plans, and how they were so close that this would be the last time this was needed, how they had finally achieved their goal. The group tried desperately to try and find a way to stop what was about to happen, but in a swift, very powerful martial remover in response to Radek basically spitting at the man and telling him to go fuck himself, the man plunged his fist into Radek's chest and ripped out his still beating heart. Crushing it in his fist, the blood ran into the streets and began to glow. And the blood poured all out from the city, from many sacrifices and slaughtered civilians that the cultists had done. The blood spread everywhere, glowing, creating these dark ley lines in the streets, sigils of magic runes, and then the ground began to pulse. And buildings far off in the city began to crash as a mound was lifting up through the sand. And what burst forth from the black sand was the skeletal remains of a long dead dragon, forced back into on life as a Dracolich. The dragon, furious at this, attempted to attack the cultists, but the bald man, who from the conversation he said seemed to have somehow made himself into the dragon's phylactery, used some sort of powerful control this gave him over the dragon and ceased its rampage. Mounting up, as the civilians, of course, had already fled at this point, and Ramza and the flight, Brazin and the flight, sorry, Ramza was not there, I assure you. Brazin and the flight were busy trying to rescue the party, fighting with cultists, as the civilians caused just mass chaos as they fled. The stranger, the cult leader, mounted up on the dragon, and the pair of them took off, heading south. The party, once freed of their bounds, ran as fast as they could to get away from this mess, as the dragon, who was in the air now, was just destroying parts of the city with its lightning breath. The group got into their caravans and fled as fast as they could, eventually seeing the dragon flying off away from the ruins of the city south. This led into a few weeks of pretty hard depression. During their time unconscious, many members of the party had had very weird dreams. Aesir had saw his adopted father fighting some strange pig-like winged creature. Something so strong that his father seemed to be losing, You don't know this at the moment, so I'll tell you now. Aesir has a unique background, a homebrewed background unique to my setting. Uh, he was adopted by a family of dragons. For in my setting, there is a collective of 10 houses in a different continent where dragons have decided to live mostly in the guise of mortals, breeding with the people they love and living out their life rather peacefully, still hoarding things, but as dragons a part of the world instead of being away from it. And Aesir was adopted by one of these houses when he was very young. So the idea that his father, a powerful dragon, would be having an issue in this fight made Aesir's blood run cold. And as he had fled the city, he discovered an amulet on his person that he hadn't had before. A sort of ritualistic thing done by the dragon houses, where the father would put a drop of his blood into an amulet and pass it on to his children. Something that hadn't happened to Aesir, as adoptive children don't normally get that. It's normally a blood to blood thing. Uh, Beyond this, a few other people had rather concerning dreams, including Riok, who saw a giant mountain of a man crying, weeping quietly in a dark room, all on his own, holding a toy, which made Riok very concerned for the well-being of his own family. And Blair, who for some reason seemed to have visions of that artifact, that strands of rubies and that opal being made. And when she watched, it looked as if the person making it was a changeling like her. Very weird and haunting dreams, and with the fact that they had rather handedly gotten their asses kicked, and that Radek, that kind halfling who had tried to help them, was dead. And with Ambar crushed that his cousin was no longer with them. It was a very sad, quiet ride for quite some time. And then they came across Darn's Canyon. A huge rip through the eastern, it's the eastern part of the continent, from where a large part of the ocean floor was lifted up as the continent was formed. It created this deep canyon where at the bottom you can't even see it because of the heat from the air and how muggy it is. It creates this sort of permanent mist and fog. The sand at the bottom of it is actually more like a silt, this thick layer of salt and and just sort of biomass. It's kind of disgusting. It's sort of like what you could imagine walking at the bottom of the ocean would be. Just layers of this thick, grimy salt mixed with sand. To which Grenier very avidly stated they were not a fan. But in order to save as much time as possible and recoup the time they lost, they decided to take this route through the canyon. It would also almost guaranteedly get them out of view of any Draco Liches flying by. So they made their way into the canyon, their feet soaked with this salt, and it was all pretty goddamn nasty. During the first day, they found a group of young and corrupted Sandalgoras, six-legged feline beasts that are blind but amazing predators using their other senses. A keen sense of smell and a bit of tremor sense to hunt their prey through the sands. They ended up fighting several small ones and fleeing before a really big one arrived. After fleeing this encounter, having dealt with the small ones, they found a stranger, a traveler, a dwarf by the name of Magnus Ballston, who wore a garishly wide-brimmed hat with a large pink feather, extremely fine nobleman's clothes of bright various colors, with a large, oddly shaped crossbow. He seemed to be an eccentric sort, and the group, after speaking with him for a while, discovered that he was a nobleman from Calimare, a bit of an explorer and adventurer, who had come out to Darn's Keep, to Darn's Canyon, to just do a bit of research. And he was probably about to head back, so it was pretty convenient that the group was there, and he could go with them if they wanted the extra muscle around for the next little leg of the trip. The group, after having weathered some of the storm and some of the flight having died by this point, not any of the named members of the flight, which there are quite a few, but it was still hefty losses that they don't like having to deal with. So the fact that this dwarf wanted to come with them made them anxious, but also was something they would allow. The party spent quite a bit of time talking to Magnus and learning more about him. Uh, in particular, Aesir seemed fairly infatuated. Uh, and during the early morning the next day, Magnus let Aesir look at his glasses. These weird, multi-bespeckled, alternating glasses that had all sorts of different colored and shaped lenses. Aesir, when wearing them, discovered that they could let him see strands of astral energy connecting everything. And after a bit of time of seeing all these strands connecting them to each other and people beyond, it eventually just became this brilliant white ball of light, showing how everything, through the arcade weave, is intrinsically connected. And it was a very humbling experience for the young Kitsune. Especially since Magnus walks around with those glasses on all the time, and by the time Aesir was ready to take them off, they were really beginning to hurt his head. They discovered that Magnus is a sort of an artificer, which is odd because artificers in my setting really don't exist. It's not a class I would normally let people pick unless we can come up with an interesting way to make it work in the story. Magnus is really unique, a very ancient dwarf, well over 200 years old, uh, and quite skilled. During their trip, they ended up falling, quite literally, into an old temple, where they ended up becoming besieged by undead Shahagwan. At which point, Ryok, as great as he is, started what is another great running trend in this campaign, and used inflict wounds on an undead, healing it. It's sort of become a running gag that Ryok doesn't really know how to heal people, and has, at this point in the campaign where we're at now, I believe 3 times healed their enemies with negative damage onto undead. It's a wild ride, this campaign. In defeating the Shahagwans, they discovered a small pearl, something that they believed had some sort of divination magic, but they weren't really sure of what it did, so they just pocketed it and made their way out. During the fight, however, they realized that Magnus's crossbow was loaded with wands, and that he would shift which wand was loaded into the crossbow and shoot spells out of his crossbow. It was pretty interesting to them, and they found the gadget quite cool. Journeying with Magnus the rest of the way to Calimare, they didn't really have any other major encounters, mostly just roleplay and conversation, learning more about Magnus and Calimare. He explained that there was an odd magical phenomena happening around the same time each day, and it was very weird. It was like a disturbance that only he and a few powerful wizards in the city were picking up on, and he'd gone to do some investigating to try and figure out what it was. The group arrived at Calimare in the shadow of the huge mountain looming out of the desert, a smaller pyramid made of black stone resting inside the walls of the massive city, which is one of the biggest cities in my setting and houses a population of about 10 million people. It's big. It's fucking huge. Way bigger than any other city I've ever had to roleplay in. I have to use whole maps just for one district of this place. It's nuts. And the party were waiting to go in through the clean, non-caravan section, basically breaking off from the party. As the caravan had to go through customs, basically. They still would need to go through their own customs, but it was much more informal. And while they were waiting and talking to one another, Aesir felt himself drawn to a certain part of the area. Concerned, they all went to ask Aesir what was wrong, and that's where he was holding a little box in his hand. A box he had noticed was on his person, around the same time he found that bag of gold, well, way back in Rosmaran. They tried to pull the box out of his hand, as it seemed that he was going catatonic and just sort of drifting off, but they couldn't. And then there was that magical pulse Magnus had mentioned, and a rift opened in the sky, pulling the players into it. At this point, the players aren't on Kansas anymore, I'll tell you what. Our players awaken themselves and find them surrounded by a small group of about 6 people, varying widely. They see an orc, a human, a tiefling, a half-elf, a halfling, and a drow. And they're in this very dark world, and the ground beneath them is hard, rocky brimstone. After initial distrust and concern, they discover they're on a different planet, a place called Dakar. And they met these groups of people, just an odd group. The orc named Grook, the halfling Tula, Peace and Valiant, the tiefling and half-elf, Dorval, the elderly human man who seemed to be the head of this other group, and Sasha, a drow. They discovered that they had been teleported to another world, and this seemed to make Dorval quite upset, because the thing that teleported them here seemed to have been something he was hired to transport, as he had taken up a job as a smuggler, basically. Promising the party he would find a way to undo this, they would need to join him on the travel back to another planet to figure out what had happened. And they discovered that this place has 5 planets, and they're connected through the Feywild and the Shadowfell. Using natural or magically created portals, one could travel from world to world, and basically got stuck with them. They learned a bit more about the world and had fun sessions of learning what languages they had that were similar to one another, and what things people had and what they didn't have, especially in the food and flora and fauna departments. And it was a pretty fun time of meshing, just players meeting basically a PC group from another planet. At this point, however, Leah's player needed to leave the group, which put me in an awkward position because Leah was still with the party in another plane now, but what am I supposed to do? So Leah just sort of drifted into nothingness, and we'll say that she got returned with the party later, but So after traveling through Dakar for a while, they met up with an agent that Dorval had told them they would be meeting, a tiefling by the name of Morse. Morse, who is a new player who joined because Leah's player left, would help escort the group through the Shadowfell, being a native of Dakar who sort of serves as one of Dorval's scouts, and basically is one of his agents on the planet who is quite skilled at the Shadowfell as well. The group went into the Shadowfell where the party split up, not wanting to draw the attention of too many undead hordes. The Shadowfell being this large, gray plane with a ceiling about 17 feet high. They pushed their way through a lot of undead, just a mass of them. During the fight, which Aesir, names, give me, just, fucking, come on, it happens. Aesir attempted to breathe lightning, just out of sheer frustration at the massive enemies before him, and succeeded, showing that he had abilities that he didn't realize he had, or the amulet was giving him odd abilities. And when he arrived on this plane, he had seen the ghost of his father, it seemed, or somehow was communicating mentally with his father. We shouldn't call it the ghost of. He was just having visions of his father, and they were able to communicate with each other. It was very weird, and still hasn't been properly resolved. After surviving the fight with these creatures, the group pushed on. Blair seemed very confused that Acer was able to do that, and Acer was equally confused. And Acer's father, who was just sort of lingering nearby, said, "Well, has she ever tried to breathe lightning?" And he was like, "I don't think she's ever tried to breathe lightning. Why would she? She's a half elf." And Blair's like, "Oh, I'll try." And then she also breathed lightning, her chest swelling to unnatural sizes. The party at this point is getting pretty freaked out by all this and just wants to get back to Jerome. Uh, they traveled a bit and learned more about Dorval and Sasha and the other group. That Dorval is Valiant's father, but there's a very strained relationship. They also learned that Sasha and Dorval are lovers of a sort, and that there was a whole lot of bad sort of juju going on between that family. The next day, they pushed on, hoping to get through the Shadowfell, but they needed to cross a river of flesh that carved its way through the land. And as they sprinted and flew across, Moors carrying Blair in the air with his wings, they became assailed by some large gelatinous cube of flesh, which the party then began moving to dispatch, though Blair kept repeatedly calling for them to flee, having thrown all of her daggers at the thing within the first round of combat. The party pushed on, and Grenier very nearly died. And Kieran ended up taking a lot of damage too before the thing was stopped thanks to a mixture of divine magics, Aesir's bow, and Sasha knowing that this particular creature is weak to acid damage. Blair was extremely shook by this as the party made it to the other side of the river and began demanding, like, an explanation why they wouldn't just run. She was sort of breaking down, feeling useless in combat like this where she didn't have her daggers, and that unless they were ready to really fight something, all of them together, they should just leave or they could have died. And she also got very mad at Riok, who, when Grenier went down, couldn't help him because he refused to prepare any healing spells. Also, he healed the creature during the fight, which was number 2 of the let's heal the undead things. Or 3, part 3, because I think he healed one of the random zombies too. But he did it again, which, the party was starting to get mildly murphed at. Especially in a situation where Grenier almost died. So this whole thing shook Blair pretty deeply. Uh, it's also important to notice that Magnus got teleported with the group, but the rest of the party was again in a different spot. So Ambar and Brazen aren't there. Making their way through the rest of the way of the Shadowfell to a natural portal, they made their way to the planet that they learned was called Kinya. On Kenya, there was a safe house, another safe house. They'd been staying at safe houses this whole journey, but this one was much nicer, like a deluxe hobbit hole, in a deep green field. Moors, who is a native of Dakar, had never seen grass like this before. He'd never seen this much green in his life. And Grenier, who had just spent months traveling through a blazing hot desert and deep, thick, salt-filled trenches, was quite happy to be in a field of green. While spending some time in this journey, Kieran had ended up getting pretty intimate with a few members of this other party, having shared the night with Tula, while Tula's partner, Grook, was nearby, sort of enjoying the whole scenario, which was also in the group's cuddle pile. The group kind of just sleeps all together because they have 2 kitsune, which are extremely comfortable, I guess, with all the tails. Makes sense. Which was very awkward for Blair, who woke up while this was happening with Kieran. And then once at this safe house, Kieran ended up getting rather intimate with Sasha several times. It was kind of a marathon run. After enough time, though, and a little bit of more roleplay flavor between the characters and trying to deal with Blair's... I skipped over something so important. I'm sorry. The night before leaving the Shadowfell, after Blair had her meltdown, Magnus pulled Blair aside and decided to help her. He had been with the party for a few weeks now and was starting to grow fairly attached. Using powerful magic scrolls on his person, he managed to summon up a rather impressive structure far away from the party. And along with the help of his fox familiar, a Cath, he began working on a dagger, with Blair helping and wearing his glasses. As he crafted this dagger, using her, he told her to grab a hold of the strands coming from her body and to wrap them around the dagger at key points during its creation, eventually binding the dagger to several members of the party through the connection that she shares with them through the astral weave. He created a very powerful dagger known as Blair's Courage. We have art for this, and I will be showing it during the next recap of our session, just to let everyone know what that looks like. The crafting of this made him quite exhausted, and he would spend the next 3 days in Kenya and the Shadowfell, basically comatose, trying to recover. Blair herself was fairly exhausted, but it was a powerful dagger that would return to her hand always, no matter how many times she threw it. And it also did other various magic effects if it was thrown near the people she was trying to protect. And as this was done, Magnus made sure to tell her not to lose her courage again. And she promised she wouldn't. And she held the dagger very close and walked back with the old dwarf, arm in arm, his body spent from the crafting. Now, the party spent a few days in Kenya resting and waiting for Dorval to arrive, eventually showing up with a beaten and battered cleric, the one who had hired them. He had discovered that the cleric was attempting to smuggle dragons into another planet, dragons being a unique thing to Kenya. They don't exist on the other planets in this setting. So he had hoped that by contacting another world, they could steal dragons from another planet and pour them in Jakar, accidentally finding Aesir instead of a dragon. They had the priest set up the circle that would allow them to transport the group back, and they did. They said their goodbyes, and the group left. Riok had a moment where he connected a bit to Dorval's spirit and spoke with Dorval a lot, as Dorval was a shaman who was connected to a spirit known as the Lidless Murder, a raven spirit, which had made its connection with Riok as well, drawn to the cleric, giving him the ability to summon a fraction of the murder as a part of his channel divinity. The group teleported back to Jerome now, ready to continue on, and they noticed Moores was with them, as at the last second, several of them had noticed that Moores was standing on paint that was used to create the circle that would teleport them back. I needed a way to keep Moores as part of the story, and this seemed like a fun enough way to do it. But the group was back. It was late at night. Magnus used his political position as a nobleman of the city to get them into the walls well after the gates had been closed for the night. And they rushed to his sister's forge, McTerith Supplies Limited, I believe it was. After a night there, the group got prepared to try and figure out what had happened to their friends, Brazen and Amber, discovering that weeks had passed since they had been teleported away. During the day, Aesir, while traveling, thought, well, if I could breathe lightning, maybe I could try seeing true sight, like a dragon. And it worked for a little while. His amulet going cold again, but it worked. And when it worked for him, he tried to get Blair to do it as well, and she seemed to be able to do it too, though it strained her eyes greatly and changed their physical appearance. At this point in the story, Aesir is the only member of the party, beside Magnus, who knows that Blair is a changeling, so they seem fairly convinced that she's just doing weird changeling things. They went out for a breakfast of curry at a local place in the city, having stayed in the trade district that night. Once they had a map from Magnus of a place where they could stay for cheap, and the promise that once he found their friends, he would get a hold of them there, they set off. Blair, Aesir, and Kieran went to meet her contact in the city, Ser and Zor, members of her trading guild, who she was supposed to be coming here to train under, while the rest of the party made their way to the Orellin Orrery, an ancient Aviax building which was being used as a tavern. They got room for the night while Blair caught up with Sarah and explained some of the weird things happening to her body that Sarah, also a changeling, couldn't really explain. Confused, that other group made their way to the orrery as well. And there, Acer had the idea, well, watching the other members of the party who could fly, or glide gracefully, that he wanted to try growing wings to see if the amulet would let him do this as well. But he had already used the amulet that day, and it was still cold. And when he tried, nothing happened. However, he and Blair were going to try at the same time, and Blair's body began to warp and pull itself apart. It made wings, but they were much too big, and the body tried to compensate for the added weight, and muscle structure began swelling and ripping itself apart. It was a very painful experience, not just for Blair, but for Kieran, who was watching. Aesir also got smacked by one of those wings into a wall, pretty hard. Blair reflexively managed to stop the transformation she had started, uh, but it left her near death with many levels of exhaustion. The party was horrified by this and set her up to sleep for the night. Went to drink off whatever had just happened. Still not sure what's happening to Blair or how they can stop it. In the morning, a scout sent out by the tavern owner came back and let the group know that they had figured out where their friends were. They weren't able to get a hold of them to let them know that they were here, but they knew where they were, and if they could find a nobleman to get them into the palace gardens, they could probably meet up with them. The group knew that Magnus was a nobleman and could get them into the palace gardens, so they decided to... Well, they were going to decide to wait to figure out how to get a hold of Magnus, but Blair, still heavily exhausted, having not been able to sleep well, terrible images haunting her mind all throughout her rest, of someone sitting her down and forcing her form onto her, the sort of half-elf form she used currently, and was not really thinking clearly and just wanted to get to Sarah as soon as possible. But Jerome is massive, and Calimare is huge, and the city is so populated that as she stumbled her way into the building, she got swept away by the crowd. Aesir rushed, but lost sight of her quickly. She ended up stumbling into a small domed building known as the Apothecary. Inside, there was a Kitsune doctor by the name of Jin Zhao. Jin Zhao, seeing how sickly she was, basically demanded she sit down on one of his medical tables, took as much information from her as she was willing to give, and began making some medicine for her, something to help mask the pain of her exhaustion, to at least let her get through the day to the point where she could sleep properly. She refused to just rest. So he's like, well, I mean, if you just keep walking around like this, you're just going to die. So I'm going to make some medicine to help you at least get to the point where you're ready to rest. Aesir, still looking for Blair, ended up stumbling into the twofold gem. The highest class, most expensive inn in the entire place, only on the grace of his family's crest on his cloak, as his travel gear isn't really up to the usual dress code of the establishment. And he was very quickly turned out when they realized he wasn't a customer, he was just looking for someone who was lost who they didn't know, so get out. He did eventually find the right place, but that was only because through Jinzhao working to contact Blair's friends, Ser and Zor, for them, he'd spotted Zor, who he had met the day before, moving through the crowd, very intently. When they got to the apothecary, Blair had already taken her medicine and drifted off to sleep, snoring very loudly, which was quite unlike Blair. And when the two of them tried to stir her, she wouldn't get up. And no matter what they did, she wasn't getting up. And the doctor was very concerned that something went wrong with his medicine. And he was like, this was fine, this shouldn't have happened to a half elf. There's literally no reason the medicine I made would do this to a half elf. At which point, Zur and Aesir exchanged an uncomfortable look and explained that she was a changeling. And he's like, that still shouldn't have mattered, but we'll fix this, don't worry. Though Zur was very worried. Zur doesn't talk much, but they care a lot. They're big silent, but big feels. Now, during this point, the rest of the group was like, well, fuck. Well, we know where Blair was going. Blair was going to the Variant Traders Guild subsidiary, run by Sir. Let's just go there. So, they went that way. Ended up meeting with Sir, who explained to them that, she apparently stumbled into a hospital looking quite sick, and she was very concerned and began quickly interrogating the group. And they explained the horror that had happened to her the night before. And Sir fucking took off, locking the store behind her with the party chasing after her in tow, horrified of what would be happening to Blair, the member of the guild who's supposed to be her responsibility and someone she cares about. While they gave chase after Sir, Ryok ended up getting pulled into an alley on his own, separated from the group. Ryok is playing a variant of the AVX, small instead of medium-sized, and flightless, but a weird birth defect, basically. And when he, who again looks no bigger than a halfling, gets pulled into an alley, he was very nervous and immediately unleashed a fierce inflict wound, almost killing his cousin, Estevan, who had been looking for him. And when he had spotted him through the crowd, just grabbed him to pull him into the corner where they could have a moment of private. Estevan collapsed to the ground, nearly dead from the single fierce inflict wounds. Ryok began freaking out and then remembered that he could, of course, heal people as a cleric, and then did that. Estevan explained that their city, Laputa, home of cloud giants, was nearby, and that Ryok's father, the cloud giant who adopted him as a hatchling, would be so happy that his son was alive. For Ryok had disappeared from his home about a decade earlier, and many of the people there just thought he was dead, that he had fallen off the side of their floating city in the clouds, and that he had died. But Estevan was so relieved, but Ryok was concerned what Estevan was doing here, as he was currently appearing as a human instead of in his usual giant form. Estevan explained that they had heard something odd happening in the city, and that the Jarl had sent in a group of scouts, himself included, wearing a special pair of prayer beads around their wrists that would shrink them down to mortal size, but also gave them, like, base human statistics. Estevan really didn't like how hard that spell hit him. Normally something like that would be an annoyance, an itch that needs to be scratched, not a near-death threatening illness. And he was lamenting a little bit of how weak this form really made them. Ryok, now separated from the rest of the group, decided, well, shit, let's just get back to my hotel and hope people meet up with me there. The rest of the group followed Sir. During this time, Magnus, who was walking nearby, stopped as Aesir, Zor, and the now awake Blair, having had the medicine given to her that would counteract the medicine she'd taken previously, burst out of the door. Magnus was confused when the party was split, but happy that he could see his friends, and very concerned with what was wrong with Blair, especially after they had shared the moment in Dakar where he had made her dagger. He went in and spoke to Xin Zhao, alongside Zor. Zor asking if Zhao could let Seer know through sending that they were heading to the palace gardens, and that if she could get to this particular entrance to the palace gardens, the group would meet up with her. Zhao agreed, and as he went to use the spell, a halo appeared above his head with this blue floating orb. The halo itself appeared to be this crackling white lightning. Zhao being a psychic character, a psionic based character, using psionics from D&D 4th edition, where when scions would activate their powers, they would have these beautiful halos. Oh, it's just so aesthetic. I love it. I hope they don't get rid of it if they ever bring psionics to a first edition, or first party product for 5e, but like it's real sexy in 4e. The art makes it look great. So Jin Jiao contacted Sir to let Sir know what was happening and that things were changing. So Sir pivoted that group of the party to meet with the palace gate, the palace gardens. Sorry. Eventually, very slowly, the party gets into the palace gardens, walked through the great central beautiful lake, through the lush, almost jungle-like forest that surrounds the oasis center. This lake made by a wellspring that comes out of the mountain, which the gardens are built around. It's beautiful and doesn't look like anything else they've seen in the desert at this point. Eventually, they make their way to a rather nice looking manor, quite clearly the most expensive building they've seen yet, in terms of being this close to. And inside, they met with a pair of noblemen, a half-elf man and his twin sister. Their names escape me, but let me get my notes so that we can make this slightly more official, shall we? Here we go. I have many books of notes for D&D campaigns. One is 2 campaigns, one is 2 campaigns, and one is homebrew. Yeah, I'm that guy. Sorry, these are all the shops. Ah, yes, they met Lord Daedric Galveston and his sister, whose name was Vernalia. The pair of them welcoming these new guests to their home, though a little inquisitive as to who they were really, and are kind of excited to learn that. And they discover that Ambar and Brazen are here, but most of the flight has been sent on to return back to the Gralvanian archipelago to deal with the end of their job, the return trip to Ambar's father at their mansion in Krelvane. But Brazen, Hroka, the spell sword who was a member of the flight, and Ambar were still here in the city, waiting for them, staying with Lord Galveston. The party, all collected, though Blair, being upstairs, collapsed in bed, being berated by Sarah, who's equal parts furious and terrified at what might have happened to her. They sat down to enjoy a meal and earn their keep by entertaining Lord Galveston with stories of what had happened to them. And just as they were about to sit down, a human came into the room with long curled black hair and white clothes trimmed in black, who Daedric introduced as his little brother, Alistair. And that's where we wrapped up the last session. It was sort of a chaotic mess, honestly, especially with the party ended up getting split 3 ways at one point. But we've managed to make it, and that's where we're at. Our next session is later tonight, October 28th, and I'm going to go rest my voice for the next 4 hours, because not only did I work today, I then sat down and recorded this hour and 20-minute long monstrosity. If you like this campaign, have any questions about specifics, or just want to hit me up for, clarifying things that you might have found confusing, please do, especially where I did this scriptless. I probably missed things or got things slightly out of order, like the whole issue with the dagger. And it's not like I could ever forget Blair's courage. It was a really beautiful moment, and I really liked it. It was good role play for Magnus, and I really enjoy playing that character and getting into his head. But you can see how even I will have moments of confusion when doing something like this. It doesn't help the fact that I have fucking 4 campaigns on the go, right? Alright, listen, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment, or share this with your friends if any of them would find this interesting. Sil out.